Welcome. So normally, as you have noticed, we do 40-minute sessions where it's typically one or two speakers maximum, sort of giving the information in one direction. And we thought that it would be fantastic to bring some of the most knowledgeable people in the field that we have here at Øredev to answer some questions that we thought were interesting, and then some questions that you thought would be interesting to ask them. So if you'd like to, go to Slido, sli.do, and then the code is V603, and then you can submit a question, and then others in the room can upvote it. I don't think you can downvote it. And so we'll just go through some prepared questions and then see if there are any questions from the audience. If anybody feels more comfortable just raising their hand, we can absolutely do that as well. Especially if there are no questions in Slido, we'll do that. I think that's it. And I thought we could just start with going in quick introduction by Pete, Franz, and Zoe. I think we can start with Zoe. What do you work? What's your relationship with security? Because you guys come from pretty different backgrounds and have quite different perception of security, I think, which is why hopefully this panel could be really fun.
Okay. My name is Zoe Rose. I guess my background was in network architecture. I actually got into security for more of a personal way. I was in a domestic abuse relationship, and I actually got into security in a way to protect myself. So I was all self-taught, and kind of more the curiosity that got me into it. Now, 10 years down the line, I like to think I'm good, but I focus more on the human side, along with the network security, logging, and all of that fun intelligence-based stuff. I think that's it.
Thank you.
I'm Franz, and I started as a developer when I was 19, and I didn't do that much security. I thought of it as something you should do, but never thought of why I should build stuff securely or never trust user input. But I had some friends, I met them 6 years ago, and they showed me why I should care about it. So I started with actually doing security stuff back in 2012, and that was basically the time where basically a bunch of companies allowed you to hack them even though you didn't work there, using like bug bounties or responsible disclosure policies. So I used that as a learning platform to be a better developer, but also to get into the mind of how to think about security. So that's where I come from.
Right. I just when you say that some friends showed you why you should care, was that because somebody hacked your code, or because somebody showed you how cool it is to be a hacker?
But I had two friends, and we hired them as developers, but they were always sitting in the back smirking in the office, and we realized after a while that they were like monitoring everybody's web browsing history. They were like hackers by definition. Like they grew up with breaking like their heater at home, hacked recycle machines in the store to like fake receipts, and like they did like some bad stuff back then, but they also came in and started working for us, and we realized they had a pretty awesome idea about automated security. So we started a company around that called Detectify, and so they showed me like what you could actually do in terms of being malicious. Mm-hmm. But that was also something we could then use to show a bunch of companies that they were doing stuff wrong or could improve their security aspect.
Right.
So I'm Pete Jaworski. I feel like I'm the youngest on the stage in terms of my security career. I started maybe in like December 2015. Kind of dove into it, but that was just like friends. I was kind of doing like development on the side, and then I'd taken my first full-time development job because I hated my current job. And doing that, like I just figured, like who's gonna hack our site? Like whatever, security's like sanitize inputs and then don't worry about anything. And then I I was looking to make a couple extra bucks, and I found out about bug bounties, and I just kind of dove into it from there. And so now I'm at Shopify on their application security team, still doing bug bounties on the side.
I mean, when you say that you dove in fairly recently, but you have a book that has been pretty successful, I would say. And then yesterday when we talked, you mentioned that there's also going to be a hard copy of that, which is really exciting, I think.
Thank you. So when I started, selfishly, I'd like to say, I was reading a whole bunch of like these bug bounty reports, like stuff from like friends, which would be like blog posts as well as like disclosed reports on HackerOne. And a lot of times I would read them and I just like, for lack of a better term, be a mindfuck. Like I didn't know what was going on. And so I read one blog post from Igor Homokov who was talking about like OAuth, and OAuth to me is still confusing, but somebody had like plain languaged it on Reddit, and that was just like an epiphany for me. It was like, A, this is plain language, I can understand it, but B, if I'm having this problem, this person's having this problem, maybe a lot of people are having this problem. So I just went to LeanPub, and as I was reading these things, I thought, I'll just make a book of like 30 examples and I'll plain language them, and then on LeanPub I can just publish it, edit it anytime I want, and then it kind of took off. Like HackerOne reached out to me and said, this is amazing, let's make it better. So they paid for a cover, suggested that I add certain chapters, and then once that was kind of successful, No Starch reached out and was like, hey, let's do this as a physical copy. And so I said, sure, why not? Because I had no concept of time or effort. So I did that, and it's still ongoing, but it should be released Q1 next year.
Nice. And like, I mean, from my own perspective, this is how I sort of discovered you, and this is also how I discovered France through your book, because I had the exact same problem that you described. Like, I would be reading bug bounty reports, and I was like, what does this mean? Like, how do I replicate this so that I actually understand how the whole vulnerability was exposed, and how would you how you could exploit it? So yeah, I mean, great job there, at least. That's yeah. I think that we have inadvertently almost covered the first question, which is what made you interested in the cybersecurity space. So we'll go to the second thing that I thought that would be interesting to hear your take on, which is, do you prefer open source to commercial software, and which one is safer to use? Because I think this can be a very contentious question to discuss in certain circles, because people have very diverse opinions. So what would your take on that be?
Do you want me to start? I guess my it depends. Like, I wouldn't say either of them is necessarily more secure. I would say I prefer one to another, but I'm also poor and, got into security through self-taught. So I obviously like open source. I always like bringing back, like, educating other people as well as making things available. There are benefits to corporate, of course. My old clientele was ultra high net worth, high profile, and celebrities. And as you can imagine, anything open source, anything that's not like quite locked down, quite, they can have on their property on-prem and all of that, they didn't really go for. Mm-hmm. So I actually have more experience working with corporate subscriptions, quite expensive subscriptions. But in my personal life, I suppose I have more of the open source sort of background. I wouldn't say either one are more secure, because we're all humans and we're creating it. I would say that sometimes corporates have a bigger budget, but then on the other side, open source has a lot more people that are wanting to be a part of something bigger to make a better solution. So I think it really depends on what the software is, what it's doing, what your requirements are. I know I'm doing the really lame answer of, well, it depends. Apparently I'm a good consultant. But no, I think it really depends on who you are, what you're needing it for, and what the solution needs to actually do.
Yeah, to add to that, I think, I'm not even going to answer the question, I'm just going to talk around it. But I'm thinking more like there have been like a lot of articles around like, oh, look at how many vulnerabilities Chrome had. It must be the most vulnerable browser there is. But it turns out that it's actually the opposite, right? Because they had a bunch of vulnerabilities because a lot of people have been looking at it. And it's similar to talking about like WordPress as an example of an open source. And there's like this thing where like WordPress blogs get hacked all the time. But most of those examples are not in the actual core of WordPress. They could be like third-party plugins being the way that they get breached, and some of them are open source, some of them are not. So I think an ecosystem of a healthy open source project could be just as secure as, or even more secure than enterprise software. And like my personal, like looking from the, I'm also like running a bunch of businesses, so we acquire a bunch of services from other companies, and I tend to have like the attitude towards third parties whenever I like want to buy their product, to ask them like how, like, did you have any recent vulnerabilities? How do you have any responsible disclosure policy? Are people able to contact you? Like, I'm more interested in like, people will always have vulnerabilities and applications will always have vulnerabilities, but I'm more interested in like, if you have a vulnerability, is there a process there to actually take care of it? I think that's nowadays probably more important than do you have any vulnerabilities, because the answer will always be yes.
Right, so like the biggest red flag might almost be, we have never had a vulnerability.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Like that might be the scariest thing that you could hear.
It's pretty much the exact same thing at Shopify. Like that's the approach that we take, like to Echo, is we look at, it's not so much as a closed source versus open source. It's kind of like, what is it? What does the security team look like, and what does that process look like? So you can be open source and everybody have access to it, but nobody be looking at it, or just not have a responsive security team versus something that's proprietary, but a team is very responsive, very open, and has feedback in terms of what they're actually doing. And so that's typically how we'll look at something and evaluate it.
There was an example of like a terrible, like an open source, everything was for free. It's like Rocket Chat, I think. They had like so they had a public pull requests or issue list on GitHub, and one of the issues was basically like, if you send an empty request, you will get back credentials for a user. Basically, you can sign in as anyone. And like this would have been a perfect opportunity to actually like be like doing good and like fixing it really fast, but that issue was there for like a couple of months. So even though you can argue that like open source gets more eyes on it, like if you don't have a healthy process of getting stuff fixed, it doesn't matter at all.
Yeah, I didn't actually think that we would get to a concrete, specific answer, but I thought that the discussion around it would be, this interesting. I think we can see, what do you consider the best approach to identify and fix vulnerabilities? What would and I think, like, I suspect I have, I have some guesses on what you might say, especially
Biased.
over there.
So I can start. So I see two different ways. I see it as I am today, like a security researcher helping out companies that I don't work for or I'm not hired by. But of course, I would say like having a proper channel of communicating, having external people communicating with your team. It could be as easy as you have like a security.txt file. There's like a specification right now, like a proper like RFC around how to have a security.txt file on your domain to know where to contact if you find a security issue. It could be stuff like that, having a security email address open that actually reaches not the legal team, but the people that can actually change stuff. But looking from the other perspective of actually like acquiring, like having a bunch of developers building code all the time, I'm more of a like, I need to assume shit is gonna hit the fan at some point. So I rather like find smart ways of doing monitoring of actually when stuff is being exploited than trying to fix all the vulnerabilities there is. So that's maybe a weird mindset, but I'm like, if you're working with a huge legacy data or like a platform or a system, sometimes you might not be able to like fix them all. Instead, you need to just like, okay, can I actually identify when someone tries to abuse this, for example?
Right.
I think from my point of view is obviously going off of that as well is the intelligence side of understanding, like, as I said, my background's network architecture. It's really hard to spot a vulnerability. It's really hard to know if something's wrong if you don't know what's right. And so the biggest thing is building that baseline of what's normal to you. for me, it makes more sense in the network because I know, like, okay, this type of traffic, this amount of traffic, that's normal. These users, that's their normal work schedule. You know, that makes sense. And when that's off or slightly changed, then I can start looking into it, and I can set alerts to notify me when something doesn't quite seem right. The communication one is a really, really major one, because I'll go into an organization quite often, very large organizations, and they'll be like, oh yeah, we had a phishing email back in February. I'm like, oh, okay, so what happened? Oh, don't know, didn't really do anything with it. And I was like, oh, well, was it successful? Did you get breached? Don't really know. We didn't look into it. And I'm like, oh, okay. So, did you unofficially hire someone then that's on your network now? Because they didn't know what to do. They also didn't know who to talk to, and they worked there. So having that security thing would have been awesome if it was external, but internally they also need to know that. That's
Right.
often what's missed. And having more of a holistic program that kind of motivates people intrinsically versus extrinsically to actually try and communicate more, instead of having the carrot and the stick approach where it's like, well, if you make a mistake, we punish you. If you succeed, we give you a carrot, we give you I don't know, some kind of prize. Looking at more the intrinsic, where it's like, I want to feel like a part of something bigger. I want to feel like I'm making a difference, and using things like gamification, because you can have the best, sexiest tools in place, but if nobody knows how to use them, or nobody is actively maintaining and using the policies and procedures you've put in place, it's actually not going to get anywhere. And so I think I like to explain it as, instead of saying users are our weakest link in the chain, or whatever that term is, I say users actually can be our greatest asset, both the technical and the non-technical, because they're the ones that are going to make the difference. They know what their job is supposed to be, and then they'll be able to tell when it's different. I think I answered that. Sometimes I go in rants. So really it's, the communication and understanding where you are to begin with anyway.
But I think like that's to me, identifying the trends and then looking for discrepancies. That sounds very, very wise. And then the process in place. I would say that's probably very often the biggest problem, as you have both emphasized.
Yeah, it's. I think I wasn't just going to echo what both of you have said. The other thing is I think it starts with the buy-in. At least for us at Shopify, is kind of identifying security as something we should be doing early and often. And with that, we can start identifying our approach. So we have the internal tooling that obviously will try to identify things proactively, like peer reviews, but then security trainings and what have you internally. An example being we've had repos that have been published publicly, which are not supposed to be. They're supposed to be private. So internal tooling in just terms of tripwires. So when that happens, the security team automatically gets a notice. Or if code goes out that hasn't been reviewed by 2 people, security team will be noticed and we get flagged. But then recognizing all of that, vulnerabilities still exist. So the bug bounty program for us in Shopify is almost like another line of defense in this kind of continuous circle in terms of our development and how things flow out of Shopify.
To add 2 more concrete examples, we got one of the companies I work for inherited a legacy product, 10 years old, and we knew 2 things. It's going to have a bunch of cross-site scriptings and it's going to have a bunch of SQL injections. That was the fact. And we were either we could spend a bunch of months trying to fix all these things, or we just do something different. So what we did was, instead of focusing on patching all of those, we instead made sure that if any SQL error, because that's one of the first things that happens when you try to find a SQL injection, is that you're actually triggering an error. The person that actually are abusing a SQL injection without triggering any error, good job. But it's very super rare. So we focused a lot on whenever a SQL error is triggering, we have a specific Slack channel that gets an alert. Everybody has monitoring of that one in their phones whenever that happens. So we had it twice since then, and we were able to patch it in 10 minutes. And they were always bots being tracked, and you could look at the logs after that when someone else comes in and tries to what the hell, why isn't this working? So you could actually see the persons trying to abuse the SQL injection that they thought they had. The other thing we had was XSS. So what we did was we took the database, we filled the database. They had like a demo database with filled data. We took any strings or text and replaced it with a XSS polyglot that would trigger an external host. And then crawl the website with like Selenium, or like we made like a crawler that actually was like a bit intelligent. And then whenever it triggered, we knew exactly what payload it contained. And those things actually helped us into prioritizing what of the vulnerabilities we should fix the first. It doesn't solve all the problems, but at least we knew a bit about the product that we didn't know before.
Right. So being reactive rather than necessarily proactive, especially when you are, as you said, like inheriting a code base and you know that there is no chance to efficiently fix everything. Perfect. Thank you. Right. So I was looking into my phone before, which I'm very ashamed about. I'm sorry, but I was looking if we have any questions, and we do. So I'll just take the one on the one on the top. Containers and Kubernetes is high on the agenda a lot of places. Any thoughts on security on those, as well as protecting the software development supply chain?
Oh man, I really hope my colleagues don't watch this, because we are very publicly a Kubernetes shop. So we use Kubernetes. We're also on GCP, so all of that is done. If my colleagues were up here, I'm trying to channel their response. But from a security perspective, like everything is containerized, and so like that rolls over. Like there's so much automation in terms of like we use a lot of microservices. So as we're deploying code or different things change, those microservices are like taken down, ripped out, and then redeployed with Kubernetes all through automation. So developers don't have to necessarily be actually be logged into a box at all, which is great from the security perspective. Like it's all done through say different policies and configurations. So that's one thing that's great for us. The other thing is because those hosts are kind of being ripped down and brought back up all through shifting configuration, like if somebody gets a shell on one of those boxes, like it's very likely that is going to be taken down quickly, so that shell isn't going to be persistent. And then assuming it's just not the configuration that they've compromised, that shell is not going to be there when they go back up, right? So if there's obviously a problem in the application, that would have to be there to be fixed, and you could get that shell back. But that has helped us in terms of our configuration. Now, the downside to that is it was more of a GCP metadata perspective, but we did have a remote code execution problem through a metadata endpoint. So it wasn't necessarily a Kubernetes problem, but that was tied into our Kubernetes and GCP configuration. That report is public on Shopify.
Thank you. I don't know if anybody else has any opinions on.
Not really much to add, sorry.
No.
I like the containerization, it's always good.
Yeah, it's been a big thing, and I think we're looking at, we experimented at our Montreal live hacking event where we gave people access to a shell, and what we said is like, here's your own environment, you have shell access to a box, have at it and show us what damage you can do. So out of like the 40 hackers that were brought, nobody managed to find anything significant. I don't think any vulnerabilities were reported against our infrastructure, which was great. It doesn't necessarily mean that we're like, full on have no problems. I think we're going to look at an opportunity to kind of roll that out and see how we can work with more security researchers and bring on specialized skill sets to start testing that type of thing, the same way we did with Shopify scripts. And we brought out a lot of people that found bugs in mRuby for us.
Great. Thank you. We have one more futuristic question, which I think might be interesting, like again philosophically. Yeah, please do. So what about the possibility of contaminated base images?
Yeah, and that's pretty much going to like the configuration kind of being compromised. And I mean, at the end of the day, it's true. If the image, so it's not like we're pulling in, say, an image that's in a public repository or whatnot, right? Like all of it is internal to Shopify. So if that happens, I mean, I can't speak to the infrastructure security side of things, like whether or not we have the tripwires to notify of that, but everything is in Git, right? And we have 2 people reviewing and approving any PR that goes out. So if that doesn't happen, like if an attacker managed to get access to, say, a GitHub account for one of our users and they decided to push code, if they pushed code without 2 people approving it, then that's going to automatically alert for the security team and they're going to go in and figure out what's going on. If they manage to get 2 people to approve that, I think we have much bigger problems.
Thank you. Right, so I'll go to the more futuristic question, which is breaking passwords with high level of encryption takes a lot of time now. So how do we address the problem of hackers with quantum computers?
I think if you're worried about somebody breaking in with a ridiculous computer, I think you're worrying about the wrong problem. At the end of the day, no matter what passwords you're going to use, eventually they can be broken. I mean, I try and make my passwords secure, but I'm under no illusion that I'm great at randomization. I'm great at, choosing something nobody else would choose. We're humans, we have our same habits, we do things without realizing that we're doing it. I think what you really want to focus on to make your network or infrastructure future-proof is actually just layering. I really like that scene in Shrek where it's like orgs are like onions. We have layers. I like to explain that to people. Maybe not onions because onions aren't really that yummy, but like just essentially try and layer on the security because.
So tiramisu.
Yeah, I don't like that either, though. So I don't know. Do something that tastes good, that looks cool, and has layers. But basically, yeah, because at the end of the day, being a hacker, when I do my whole demystifying hackers thing, it's majority of hacks are opportunistic. They're doing their job, right? So they want to minimize the amount of work that they have to do to get something successful. So maybe they're going to have ridiculous computers, maybe they're not, but reality is you just need to be one bit better than the next person. And that one bit better can just be, well, we have passwords, we have multi-factor authentication, we have this, we have that, and that all of those layers together make it secure. Because if we're just relying on one technology or one thing, you're going to fail anyway, no matter how great it is. Because it just takes that one failure to then gain access. I like to say hackers are, their job is essentially to fail over and over and over again until one thing works, and that's all they need. And theoretically, that would be a good enough payday that it's worth the effort they put into it.
Yeah, I mean, I would echo that. I think it's going to always be the path of least resistance for hackers, right? So, like at least from the Shopify perspective, like phishing and spear phishing is just a big concern for us, right? Because you don't need necessarily to crack somebody's password. You just need to give that person to give it up to you, right? So whether or not they have a quantum computer or not, my mind goes to like if you want to go and you want to crack somebody's password with a quantum computer, you still need to have that like hashed password to actually act on. Because if you're doing it over the network, A, you're limited by the network connectivity, but B, you're just going to make a ridiculous amount of noise, right? And so we've tried to address that already with bots, right, with just silently failing on certain requests, so the bot just continues to work, and it has no clue that we're just dropping everything that it's doing. So I don't see it as something that's going to kind of change for us.
I had a thought. No, no, but I agree with both of you. Like I'm trying to think of like Peter has a point also, and Zoe as well. When you talk about like, so the path of least resistance is probably the humans, which kind of defeats the purpose why I'm doing the stuff I'm doing. Because I go to the like I try to find vulnerabilities in apps or in infrastructure, but the path of least resistance is the humans, and I'm obviously like focusing on the wrong thing. But when you think about it, it's quite obvious that the humans will be the easiest way in. So I'm thinking more of that the companies actually are interested around the unknown unknowns, the things that they expect to probably work in a certain way and suddenly don't. So I was more thinking philosophically, like, am I at the wrong place? More than like if passwords are gonna get hacked. Like I agree with Zoe. Like if you have one password, like a ring to rule them all, like you're screwed anyway.
And I don't mean to say like we would just ignore every other security vulnerability. I almost think of it like a funnel. Like at Shopify, what we would want is just people to kind of have to go down and be at that area where like that is what they're focusing on, because there's so many ways for us to kind of protect against that, right? So if we can use the bug bounty program and all the other tooling that we have to make sure that there's no XSS, there's no SQL injections, there's no IDORs, everything like that, like all of the rest of the perimeter is just solid, and then you've gone down to, okay, our password is our weakest link, like that is a good problem for us, or a good area for us to be at.
I really like this, the conclusion that quantum computation is actually not going to change all that much in this space, which might be contrary to what like most of us might assume when you first look at that question or at the problem. But yeah, I really like I like layering. I think I'm going to use that in the future. I'm going to just pick the highest voted question here. Android or iOS in terms of security? Is the myth true that iOS is more secure? I have no idea. Please.
I think that's funny. I think that's funny because I would disagree that anything is necessarily better. I would agree that in certain scenarios it is better. I have great-grandparents that I'm not going to teach them Android, but I will give them an iPhone because that's very focused on users. The only thing that I see as a benefit of Android versus iOS is actually, also I don't like calling it iOS because I have a Cisco background and those are iOS, so I'm like, I'm not going to give my aunt a router, but anyway, so let's say an iPhone, I like the App Store for Apple versus the Google Play Store, only because of the requirements to be able to get the application into it. You have to follow their standards, and that kind of, it helps. And also, I'm a director of the Ferret Association back in Canada, and I got ferrets in. Yes, but anyway, and so one of the women that works there, she has an Android phone, and she's a shelter mom. She cares about ferrets. She's passionate about ferrets. She's passionate about sharing that passion with the world, and she, uses the apps in the App Store and tries her best, but installed an app that was known to be malicious, and it was because it's so easy to get those apps in there without any real checks, versus when she had an iPhone, it was more confident for her. She was more confident in installing the apps and using them because she knew that somebody else was looking into that. I wouldn't say it's necessarily foolproof, because we've seen in the news that's true. It's not, and nothing is perfect. And if you ever buy something that says unhackable, you're probably really, really insecure. Bad idea. But I think it's the it depends solution again, where I look at what are your actual requirements. Are you a very untechnical person that just wants things to work? Are you a very technical person but again just want things to work? Or are you somebody that is willing to put the time into investigate it, needs the ultimately more functionality of Android? Do you want that path, or are you really just like, for me, I deal with tech all day. I deal with my clients' computers, their infrastructure. I want my shit to work when I go home. I really do. And so I have a Mac. Please don't judge me. But I have a Mac, and I like it because it just works. It's user-focused. Right. It's not necessarily more secure, and in fact, because I'm technical, I'll probably be overconfident and get hacked easier. But for me, it works. Versus my phone is a OnePlus. It's Android, and hopefully it's secure. It is from China. But the other side of it is the reliability of it isn't as good as an iPhone. So I'm not even talking about security, maybe availability, but I don't like that my apps crash. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's really how I view it.
I'm looking to like I'm not an Android person at all, but I'm looking more on like how the companies I work with treats issues with Android apps and Apple apps, and I've seen the conclusion that when they look for vulnerabilities in iOS apps, they try to they assume that the device is stolen. But on an Android, they assume that the device has been exploited. So it's like a different mindset that they have. Like, what can you do if someone steals your iPhone versus what can you do if you install a malicious apps in Android? So it's like echoes a bit on what Zoe says.
Building off of kind of what Zoe was talking about, the two things so I'm not in mobile application security, but the two things that come to my mind in terms of Android that have been like the biggest kind of public criticism. One is the App Store, like the ability to kind of publish whatever you want and it be malicious. However, I know like Google is trying to address that, right? So they've opened up, they have their bug bounty program, but they've also now tacked on to companies, like larger companies. And so for us at Shopify, where we're running a bug bounty program, if we get a mobile application vulnerability that's related to Android, Google has come to us and said, if you get that, we will pay a bonus to that person on top of that. So now on our bug bounty program, if you look at it, you'll see like we're part of the Google Play Rewards program or whatever. So we've had people submit vulnerabilities to us that have then earned like upwards of $5,000 from Google. And that's smart from their perspective because they can then start getting all this vulnerability information and start plopping it into a scanner. So anytime you submit a new APK, they know the different patterns to look for because they've gotten information from the large targets that are being that have had vulnerabilities, right? So they can just kind of wipe out vulnerability classes for the App Store. So that's a huge plus. So that's going to make their App Store more secure, but obviously they're not as rigid as like the Apple Store where they have to review everything.
The problem with that is that they're malicious apps, and the companies that they have the program for are apps doing stuff wrong, which is like two different parts of it. So yes, but also like if you manage to download Shopify, you will get screwed anyway. Like,
but the idea is that at least in the discussions with them is that those common vulnerability or those common attack scenarios through the APKs should be running through automatic scanning in the back end of Google so that they wipe all of that out, right? So it'll be, you'll still have the opportunity to get a malicious app in there, but you would hope that they're more like 0-day or things that are kind of a little bit more unique as opposed to the common crap that just kind of gets popped onto the store.
Yeah, I have one example that I'd like to bring up as well is, so obviously I've signed quite a few NDAs, so I can't give you too much detail, but there was a while ago a phone that I worked on that was, it was known as like the most secure phone ever, and it was quite expensive, and it was targeted more at like very high profile, ultra high net worth individuals. It's a phone that I would never have the money to spend on, but I was allowed to do a pen test against it, and the thing I found is, like you said earlier, is the perception. I was expecting this really fancy, gold-plated, sexy phone, and what I got was this really clunky, heavy Android phone. And the only thing that made it ultra secure was actually a couple apps that you can get on any phone, and it had this switch. It had a physical switch on it, which I thought was brilliant, that put your phone into ultra secure mode, not really selling it, am I? But it's basically what it did is it locked it down so that the other apps didn't work and you could only use these secure apps. But the problem was they didn't really understand the difference between security and privacy. And to me, building a secure program using something for security in mind, I'm also thinking from privacy, because going back to how I got into security, I'm a survivor of domestic abuse. I was being controlled by my abuser, and so for me, security was the security of my life, which meant privacy. And this phone, whilst it said it was so secure, it was actually the people that ran it would be like, oh, we'll notify you if you're on a malicious Wi-Fi. I'm like, if you can see what Wi-Fi I'm on, that's not very private. They're like, oh, but your phones will never be interrupted or never be caught or whatever. But they're like, but they made this joke about talking to your mistress on it. And I'm like, do you know who the people are calling then? And to me, that is just, from my senses, maybe it's secure because it's being managed, but it's not private. So really, that's why I like iOS, is because it reminds me of Cisco. It works, and I feel like it's private. I may be living in a delusion, but it's a lot more private than that other phone.
Yeah, thank you so much. I actually really don't want to break this discussion, but we are already like a minute over time,
Oh
and
gosh.
no, but like it's been such a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining for the panel. If unless somebody really needs to run away, I would like to ask one more thing. And let's limit it to a minute to a person, which might be hard. But so we have asked some questions, we have had some prepared, we have had some from the audience, which is great. What's the question that nobody's asking? And they should be.
Why don't ISA care about security? I can't speak. And the reason I think that's important is because no matter what policy, procedure, control, sexy technology you're putting into place, if that person doesn't care, then they're not going to use it. It's not going to succeed. So I like to ask people, why don't they care? Why doesn't this affect them? And it's just like the right to privacy, where people are like, oh, I have nothing to hide. And then I bring up the statistics of, well, not feeling like you have right to privacy makes it hinders your innovation. It hinders your ability to think and do what you normally act like doing, because you think somebody's watching you. And so you do what you think they want you to do. And so, that wasn't me. Sorry, I think I'm over time now. But basically, I like to ask people why they don't care, because then that gets the conversation started, and I can use detailed examples as to why they do care, and then they go home and start chatting about it with their kids and their family and their friends.
Thank you.
I've thought about this a lot the last few days, and I feel like I don't have this amazing answer, but I think at Shopify, one of the things that we do is when we get a vulnerability, from the top down, CEO all the way down, and he's publicly stated his support for this and recognizing that there will be vulnerabilities. Our approach is, how do we just make sure we don't have that problem twice, right? And so I think the question that's not being asked is, how do we take that to an industry wide, right? So we have Black Hat, we have DEF CON, we have all these security vulnerabilities where things are being disclosed. But I can tell you now, looking at some web applications, the vulnerabilities that are coming up, web cache deception, host header injections, a lot of it's stuff that's concepts that have been talked about in 2011, 12, 13. They're not new vulnerability types. So how do we take all of that knowledge that's out there and start disseminating it across an industry so that we can start removing vulnerability types and everyone building off of that knowledge that's out there?
So learning from the past a bit more.
Yeah, how do we do that?
Right. Mm.
Yeah, I was thinking in the same sense that we are doing the same mistakes all over again, and every time there's new frameworks released, the same kind of vulnerabilities that happen. As you said, they just come back over and over again, and just maybe think more of when you're creating new frameworks that that's also, there's a lot of negativity around creating something new from scratch if you don't have the history and past in your mindset. So I don't really have a question that nobody is asking, because you basically asked the question. So I kind of broke down on that one. But no, no, 1 minute. Why aren't we over yet? Why is it
Thank you so much for joining. It was a super interesting discussion. It was such a pleasure having you here. Thank you for joining, and see you around.
Thank you.
Give them a round of applause.